Hey everyone, it's John here, and in this video we're going to take a look at 19 things you need to know to master the VLOOKUP function in Excel. Make sure you hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel for future Excel videos like this one. Now let's get started. First off, what does VLOOKUP do? So VLOOKUP is going to allow you to find and return data from another table in Excel. So in this example, we have a table of data here that has names and company and email. And then over here, we've got someone's name, so Jake, and we want to find and return his email address. So we can use VLOOKUP to do that. And so the first argument in a VLOOKUP function is the value you're trying to find. So in our case, that's Jake. And then the next argument is the table of data you're trying to find that value in. So for us, that's going to be right here. And the first column in that table has to be the column that contains the data you're trying to find. So for us, that's the first name. And then the next argument we need is the column to return data from. So in our table here, we have 4 columns. So our first column is the first name, and then the fourth column is the email address. So we want to return the email address. We're going to choose column 4. And the last argument is whether we want to return an approximate or an exact match. So we want exact. And if we press enter now, we get Jake's email address returned. How does VLOOKUP work? So if I were to ask you to find Jake's email address, what you would probably do is take a look in the first name column and then scan down it until you found Jake, and then move across until you saw his email address, and you would say that his email address was jake.auger@tripod.com. And that's exactly how VLOOKUP works. So VLOOKUP is going to look down the lookup column until it finds a match, and then move across to the right until it gets to the column that you specify and return that value. The V in VLOOKUP actually stands for vertical, and that's because the data that you're looking in needs to be in a vertical format. So we need columns of data for VLOOKUP to search in. VLOOKUP has a related function called HLOOKUP, and HLOOKUP works exactly like VLOOKUP except horizontally. And as you probably guessed, the H stands for horizontal in HLOOKUP. So you can use HLOOKUP with horizontal data. So in this example, we've got our first name and all the other fields listed across a single row. So our data is listed in a horizontal fashion. We can use HLOOKUP. And in this example, we're going to be looking up the first name. And we're going to be looking in this range of values. And the table of data that you're looking in, the first row needs to contain the values that you're looking for. So in this example, the first row contains our first names. And we want to return the email address. So that's the 4th row in our range of data. And we're going to use an exact match. And we get the email address for Darcy. So that's HLOOKUP. It's very similar to VLOOKUP, but it allows you to search data horizontally. If VLOOKUP is unable to find a match in your data, then what's going to happen is it's going to return an error. So it'll return the NA error. So if we type something here that's not in our data, so John, for example, then VLOOKUP returns the NA error. Now, if you want to return a default value whenever VLOOKUP is unable to find a match, then you can use the if_error function to do that. So we can wrap our VLOOKUP in an if_error function. So the first argument in if_error is the thing you want to evaluate. And for us, that's our VLOOKUP function. And the second argument is the value you want to return if the first argument results in an error. So this formula will return not found whenever VLOOKUP fails to find a name. So let's press enter. And here we've got John, which is not in our list. So VLOOKUP and if error is going to return this not found text. And if we type something that is in our list, then we get our email address. So that's the NA error with VLOOKUP. And you can use the if error function to create a default value when VLOOKUP fails to find a match. Another error that you might encounter when you're using a VLOOKUP function is the reference error. So this happens when your column index is outside of your data range. So here I'm referencing a range of values to look in that is 4 columns wide. And in my VLOOKUP function, I'm referencing the 4th column. But if you pick a value outside of 1 through 4, then you're going to get a reference error. So for example, if we change this to a 5, we don't have 5 columns in that range. VLOOKUP is going to return the reference error. VLOOKUP is only going to be able to return the first match. So in this example, we actually have 2 marks in our first name column. So if we try to look up Mark, then what we actually get is the first mark in our list. So VLOOKUP is returning mark.junifer@amazon.com, but we also have Mark Zollner in our list at the bottom, and the email there would be mark.zollner@feedburner.com, but VLOOKUP is only able to return the first item in our list. So a good practice is to only use VLOOKUP with a column that contains unique values. So for example, in our data, we might want to use the ID instead to look up our email addresses. And this way we won't accidentally return the wrong value. So let's try that. So 286 is the ID for our first mark. And this time we're going to start our lookup table with the ID column. And this time the result we want to return is now in the 5th column. And again, we want to do an exact match. And there we go. We have our first Mark's email. And now if we want our second Mark, we can use his ID. So that's 479. And that would return that email address. So a good practice is to look up a column that only contains unique values, and that way you won't get the wrong data in your VLOOKUP. VLOOKUP is not case sensitive. So in this example, we're looking up the last name and returning the email address. And notice that the last name is capitalized, and actually the G is capitalized as well. And you can see that we're getting the correct email address. But actually having the proper case here doesn't matter. So if we enter this name as all capitals, we still get the correct email address. If it's entered as all lowercase, we also still get the email address. So VLOOKUP is not case sensitive, and it's going to return its match regardless of the letter casing that's used. VLOOKUP is only able to return values to the right. So if, for example, in this data, you want to look up the first name based on the last name, there's actually no way to do that with VLOOKUP as the data is right now. So one option would be to rearrange your data. So if we select our first name column and hold Shift and then just drag it between, now our last name is to the left of our first name, and we can use a VLOOKUP. And that would return our first name, but it's not always possible to rearrange your data. So I'm just going to press Ctrl Z and undo that. And now my first name's back to where it was. Another option is to use a helper column. So to the right, we might add in a new column and just reference the value we want to return. And we can double click and copy that down. And now we would be able to use VLOOKUP on our last name. And this is in the fourth column. And we want an exact match. And now we get our first name based off of our last name. So because VLOOKUP can only look to the right, we either need to rearrange our data or add a helper column on the right-hand side. VLOOKUP on its own can only look up values to the right, but you can use the choose function with VLOOKUP in order to look up values to the left. And that way you can avoid using a helper column or rearranging your data. So the choose function is going to allow us to dynamically create a lookup table of 2 columns. So first, let's create our VLOOKUP function, and we're looking up our last name. And now we're going to use the choose function, and the index is actually going to be an array. So we need some curly braces, and the array is going to be 1, 2. Those are going to be the 2 columns. And then the first value in our choose function is going to be our lookup column. So that's going to be our last name for us. And the second value is going to be the column containing our first name. And now we're done with the choose function. So that's going to create our lookup table of 2 columns. The first column is our last name, and the second column is our first name. And so we want to return the first name. So that's the second column in that table. And we want an exact match. And if we press enter, there we go. We have VLOOKUP that's looking to the left with the help of the choose function. VLOOKUP can only look up data based on one value. So in this example, we could only look up data based on either the first name or the last name, but not both. But we can use a helper column to get around this limitation. So we can add a helper column to the start of our data. And in this column, what we're going to do is join our first name, and we'll use the ampersand to concatenate and join that to our last name. And we can copy that down. And now we can use VLOOKUP with our first and last name. So we can look up our first name joined to our last name. And this time we'll start from our helper column. And now our email address is the 6th column in that range. And we'll use the exact match. And there we go. We can now use VLOOKUP to look up based on 2 criteria. So now if we change the last name, we'll get a different value. Inserting a column with VLOOKUPs in your workbook can be dangerous because inserting a column in the wrong place could break your VLOOKUPs. So in this example, we're looking up the email address based off the first name. So we're referencing this range of data. And if we were to insert a column, so maybe insert a column right here, then you can see that we're no longer returning the email. We're actually returning the company name instead. And that's because the column index is a fixed hard-coded number, so it's always 4, and that doesn't change when we insert a column. So you can see that inserting a column has increased our data range, and the email address is now actually the 5th column in that range. And the 4th column is now the company name, so that's why we're returning the company name. So when you hard code the column reference, you need to be careful about inserting columns in your workbook. With VLOOKUP, you don't have to hard code the column reference. This can be a dynamic input. And to do this, I like to use the match function. So let's edit our VLOOKUP formula. And instead of 4 here, what we're going to do is use the match function. And what the match function does is look for a value in an array and then return its position in that array. So we're going to look for email, and we're going to look for that in the column headers, and we want to find an exact match for that. And we can press enter. And now we're still referencing the 4th column based on this cell here having the word email in it. Now we can change what value we're looking up by changing this value here. So we can look up the company, for example. And this is also going to solve the problem of inserting columns. So if we insert a column, then our reference stays the same. So that's how you can dynamically reference the column index with the match function. With VLOOKUP, you'll usually want to use an absolute reference to reference your data. And that way you can copy down your formulas and still be referencing the exact same data. So if I press F2 to edit this, then I can highlight my data range. And then I can press F4 to turn that into an absolute reference and lock that reference down and press enter. And now I can copy down my formula. And then each of those formulas is going to reference the exact same set of data. Another option to get an absolute reference would be to turn your data into a table. So if we select our data, we can go up to the Insert tab and use the Table command and turn that data into an Excel table. And now we can reference that table. And Excel is going to create a table reference for us. And if we copy down our formula, then we can see that we're still referencing that same range. We can use wildcard characters with VLOOKUP to return partial matches. So let's edit our VLOOKUP formula. And what we're going to do is combine the lookup value with a wildcard. So let's use an ampersand and combine that with the asterisk character. So the asterisk character is a wildcard that can represent any value. So with this, we're now going to be looking up anything that starts with Jake. And let's press enter, and we still get Jake's email address. Now if we enter something like JA here, what we're doing is looking up values that start with JA and then can have anything after that. So for us, that's still going to be Jake's email address that is returned. Let's try a V there. Here we get Vin's email address. So that's the first name that starts with a V. And you can put this wildcard character anywhere in your lookup. So it could be at the start, and we could look for things that end with a certain letter. We can also use the question mark character, which is a wildcard for just a single character, whereas the asterisk can represent any number of characters. So that's how you can create partial matches with VLOOKUP and using the wildcards. VLOOKUP also has the ability to return an approximate match. So in our previous example, we looked at using the exact match to return an email address from a list of names. In this example, we're going to use the approximate match to return a letter grade based on a percentage test score. And we're going to be looking in this table of data right here. So we've got scores and the corresponding letter grade. And for example, a score between 50 and 60% will return the grade of D. And a score between 60 and 70 would return C, etc. So let's use approximate match to do that with VLOOKUP. And we're going to be looking up the score of 55.5%. And we're going to be looking in this range here. And we want to return the grade. That's in column 2. And this time we're going to use the approximate match. And that's what we get. We get a grade of D as we expect. And what VLOOKUP is doing with the approximate match is it's looking down the score column until it finds the largest value that's still smaller than 55.5%, and then returning the corresponding value in the grade column. So in this example, 50% is the largest value in my data that's still smaller than 55.5%. And so I get the grade of D. If we try another score, so 65%, then in this example, 60% is the largest value. That's still smaller than 65%. And so we get a grade of C. To use VLOOKUP's approximate match, you actually need to have your data sorted in ascending order. So right now, this data here is sorted in ascending order, and that's why this VLOOKUP here is working. As an example, if we select our data and go up to the Data tab and sort this in descending order, then you can see that our VLOOKUP is no longer working. So to use approximate match, you need to sort your data in ascending order. The match type inputs for a VLOOKUP function can also take the values of 0 and 1. So if I edit my formula and just delete that, you can see that IntelliSense shows the values as either true or false that you can select for the match type. But we can also use 0 and 1. So 0 is going to be for false. And we can also replace true as 1. So you might see those arguments as true or false, or you might see them as 0 or 1. Just remember that 1 is the same as true, that's an approximate match, and 0 is the same as false, that's an exact match. The match type argument in VLOOKUP is actually an optional argument. So if I press F2 to edit this VLOOKUP formula, then you can see in the tooltip that the range lookup actually has square brackets around it, indicating it's an optional argument, so we don't need it. And we can enter our function like this. But one thing to note is that when you don't include that argument, VLOOKUP is going to default to the approximate match. So you can see that this VLOOKUP is not returning the results that I'm expecting, and that's because it's an approximate match now. So the best practice is to always use that optional argument and specify whether it's an exact or approximate match. Want more awesome Excel tips? Then sign up for my Excel newsletter. So the link for that is in the description below this video. When you sign up for the newsletter, I'll send you a free copy of my Excel tips ebook. And I'll also send you a free copy of my mega book of Excel keyboard shortcuts and my ultimate guide to VLOOKUP. If you enjoyed this video, you can help me out by hitting the thumbs up button and subscribing to this channel if you haven't already done so. That's it for this video. See you in the next one.